I want to start tonight's program with a little personal story. 2 years ago, I visited Colonial Williamsburg. And one of the, there's lots of things to choose from during the day. One of the things I chose was a presentation by two American Indians. And it turned out to be straight out Marxism for an entire hour, double barreled from both of them. I went from there to a kind of like a slave house tour. And the presenter said during the presentation at one of the stops that voter ID is modern day slavery. That's right, you got it. Voter ID, which has been upheld by every court that's looked at it, and is polls well with blacks, Hispanics, Asians. That is modern day slavery. So you see what we're up against. This is one of the reasons I started this team, to fight the woke mob at places like Colonial Williamsburg. And now we're going to go to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Claudia Henneberry. She's my assistant. She's a retired teacher, and she is past executive director of the National Constitution Bee. She's author of our Constitution Challenge, which appears on our Tea Party Youth website, teapartyyouth.us. And her articles on Irish slavery appear on the Potomac Tea Party website. And Claudia is going to talk to us tonight, give us an overview of the problem, the money flows, such and the like. So Claudia, the floor is yours. Go right ahead.
All right, my report is, because all of us are in the Guardians of History, and we used to call ourselves Monticello Project, but we call ourselves both, I guess. But just so everyone knows, there is a movement underway at American museums and historic sites to, as leftist radicals like to say, advance equity and social justice. And as I like to say, history has been rewritten with a poison pen by radicals with money who hate America. All right. Okay. The Guardians of History are here to expose these radicals and what they and their money are doing to our national monuments. I will go over some of the highlights, and these are just a few highlights that we found over our past year or so that we've been working on this. For beginners, the National Archives and Records Administration in 2021 placed trigger warnings across the entire online catalog and refers to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and Bill of Rights as harmful content and difficult to view. NARA put on their website, on their catalog, what to be afraid of if you read these documents. And as you can see, this list, beginning with reflect racist, sexist, ableist, misogynistic, etc. It's discriminatory, towards or excludes diverse views on, etc. Graphic content of historical events, unbelievable. And as you can tell, obviously that's what you're supposed to be afraid of when you view our document. The National Archives has subsequently removed the harmful content and other warnings they put on our documents, which is okay, that's good. But who's to say they don't continue whatever they do? Monticello is next, obviously Thomas Jefferson's home. And if you visit Monticello, you may be able to view only a 7.5-minute film on Thomas Jefferson's political philosophy. Shockingly absent are any exhibits on Jefferson as president, vice president, secretary of state, diplomat, governor, drafter of the Declaration of Independence, and the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom, or also the founder of the University of Virginia. Docents at the museum instead describe Jefferson as a tinkerer and the father of Sally Hemings' children. My friend and co-author in this endeavor, Dr. Bob, will share more details in this story coming up. Mount Rushmore. I visited Mount Rushmore last summer and took a picture of this placard that is underneath the granite sculptures. And Thomas Jefferson is not even given credit for having written the Declaration of Independence on this placard. He, however, is given credit to be as Minister of France, Secretary of State, Vice President, and President. So that's good. Next up is Montpelier, and everyone knows that is James Madison, the father of the Constitution, his home, his lovely home. Visitors to our, in general, visitors to our historic monuments are taught that slavery was the central animating force behind the laws and economy of the United States. That without the enslaved, we wouldn't have a country. At Montpelier, home of James Madison, as we know, visitors learn little of Madison's profound intellect and his brilliant limited government design. For example, the exhibits at Montpelier barely mention James Madison's drafting of the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights in themselves, that should be an entire exhibit. One video labels Madison, obviously, a slave owner and the Constitution as racist, stating that it only applied to white men. The reading area for children at Montpelier emphasizes topics only about race, identity, of all things, and justice. And another stickler in this story, the Southern Poverty Law Center, along with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, are responsible for these exhibits. The SPLC, in fact, has produced curriculum for Virginia schools in the form of an initiative branded Learning for Justice. The SPLC has also produced a guide called The Rubric. If you're not familiar with that, it has its own website, which serves as a framework for historical sites on how they should, quote, unpack and interrogate white privilege and systemic racism, and that they should address, quote, American history in a spirit of restorative justice, unquote. Last spring, Bob Good and Eli Crane, two congressmen, wrote to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and they were asking some questions about, well, concerning Montpelier. They wanted to know, are taxpayer dollars being used to produce historically inaccurate curriculum for Virginia schools based on critical race theory? They also want to know if taxpayer dollars are being used to malign James Madison in his own home. The congressman gave the National Trust a deadline of June 1st of last year. So far, guess what? The National Trust has ignored the congressman and their questions. The loyal donors, even at Montpelier, have mostly backed away from donating because of the CRT that currently pervades from the anti-American exhibits to the docents' scripts that bash the founders and America. Next up is the beautiful Colonial Williamsburg, our largest living history museum. It's a place where essential American history happened. However, the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation is intent on taking away the emphasis on that history. Having begun its foray into queer history in 2019, Williamsburg recently partnered with the New York Historical Society to host a teacher chat on queer history and methodologies, and a workshop. They hosted a workshop on best practices for teaching queer history. And this all was sponsored by the Bob and Marian Wilson Teacher Institute of Colonial Williamsburg, and that is on the Williamsburg site if you want to go and see that. The Institute provides instructional resources, professional development opportunities for teachers, and scholarships. Best practices for teaching queer history is offered to educators at all levels, shockingly from preschool to the college level. The Colonial Williamsburg Foundation itself established a Gender and Sexual Diversity Research Committee in 2019 at Williamsburg, trying to discover stories about LGBTQ people in real times. I'm sure there were lots of those. There is now a theatrical performance at Williamsburg. If you've been there, you may have seen it, about two lesbians who supposedly lived there in the colonial era. Next up, National Park Service. And that's a picture on its website of the LGBTQ America theme study. The National Park Service now features prominently on its website LGBTQ America. This is a huge, and this thing is huge, theme study that tells stories of LGBTQ sites, places, and people. The NPS, National Park Service, also includes teaching tools and lesson plans on LGBTQ America for all ages on its website. For the record, we as a group, the Monticello Project, we do not oppose highlighting anyone who is significant in American history. We do, however, oppose the denigration and tearing down of our founders and their monuments. Next up, statues. And I'm sure that most of you saw that just 2 weeks ago, the National Park Service announced its plan to remove William Penn's statue and a replica of one of his homes at Welcome Park in Philadelphia. Within a day of public comment, the Park Service decided to abandon its plan. Even the Democrat governor of Pennsylvania asked the Biden regime not to tear down the Penn statue. Unfortunately, it was not done.
Thank you. Thank you for lots of information about the sites themselves. We're going to go on now to our second presenter, who is Dr. Robert Piles. And Dr. Piles was the president of the American Psychoanalytic Association. He did his undergraduate work at the University of Virginia, spent many years in Virginia near Monticello. And the University of Virginia, if you don't know, was designed by Thomas Jefferson. Articles about Dr. Bob's articles about Thomas Jefferson appear on Potomac Tea Party website.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, I should mention that Thomas Jefferson was my next door neighbor. My family farm just outside of Charlottesville adjoined the plantation, or the farm actually where Thomas Jefferson was born. And from our front yard, I could actually see Monticello up on the mountain. And as Chris mentioned, I went to the University of Virginia, where we always referred to Thomas Jefferson as Mr. Jefferson. Okay, well, Thomas Jefferson famously wrote that he thought this country would never be conquered by an external enemy, but that the real dangers would come from inside the country. And as with many things, he was extraordinarily prescient about that, considering what we're going through right now. The twin pillars of freedom and liberty upon which country rests are the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, and the Constitution and Bill of Rights, written largely by James Madison. And these two documents, along with the Magna Carta in 1215, constitute the three most important foundations for the rights of political freedom in the history of mankind. It's hard to believe that they are that important, but they are. The Declaration of Independence states clearly that the rights of all people are inherent and come from God and not from a king or sovereign. This was a truly revolutionary political statement, and it was even in some ways the statement was even more important, more revolutionary than the war. But the Declaration, I'll go back. That more importantly, this was a statement that had never been put into practice in a political system, a boots on the ground political system, with all men being created equal. Yet those two bedrock formulations on which our country rests are now under assault, as you know. Individual rights and national boundaries are the specific enemies of the woke progressive left. Two of their primary targets are Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and the weapons the tours at Montpelier, Madison's home, and Monticello, Jefferson's home, plus the University of Virginia, which was founded by Jefferson, focused almost exclusively on the fact that Jefferson and Madison were slave owners, and almost completely ignored the monumental achievements. These tours also disregard the tenor of the times. The fact was that almost all nations at that time owned slaves, including African and Native American tribes. Also, Jefferson is particularly attacked for being a hypocrite because he wrote, "All men are created equal," but he did not specifically mention in the Declaration of Independence people of color or deal with the issue of slavery. Yet, in his original draft of the Declaration of Independence, he included a paragraph doing away with the slave trade. At the Continental Congress in 1776, representatives from the other states deleted that paragraph because they felt that their states would not approve the Declaration if they kept it in. However, when Jefferson was president, he did away with the slave trade in 1806 by executive order. Jefferson felt strongly that the failure to deal with slavery would come back to haunt the country. On the Jefferson Memorial in Washington is his quote, "I weep for my country when I reflect that God is just." And I'm sure he could not have imagined the price we were going to pay when the Civil War happened. As another, possibly even greater assault on his character, Jefferson has been accused and convicted of having a 30-year exploitative sexual relationship with a female slave at Monticello, Sally Hemings. And this is where it gets juicy. This union supposedly 6 plus, and it has also spawned practically a cottage industry of books, novels, and even a romantic movie about the relationship, about the imagined relationship. The movie is pretty funny, actually. However, as the old saying goes, there's nothing like an ugly fact to destroy an attractive fantasy. I and a number of others have closely examined the evidence and have concluded that this relationship almost certainly never happened. However, the tours at both Monticello and UVA continue to state it as an absolute established fact. The central question would seem to be, since there's so little evidence to support it, the evidence is very thin to say the least, why would the Monticello Foundation insist on promulgating this idea? It should also be stated that this is a fairly recent development that they have put this in. In reading the Monticello study, it's very obvious that they started with the conclusion and marshaled the very sketchy evidence to support it. So the question again, why would they do that? I think it's pretty obvious that the motive must have been a political one, and the goal was to destroy Jefferson's reputation, and by implication, impugn his motive, his character, and his achievement in writing the Declaration. So it would seem that with the slavery issue and the sex charge, the woke left has succeeded in charging Jefferson with both sex and violence. As far as the accusation about the land for UVA being stolen, the fact of the matter is that there were almost no Native American settlements in the area at that time. The closest was about 10 miles up the road. The land, in fact, seems to have been acquired from James Monroe, who was a later president, and who was using it as a cornfield and a law office. He used to like to say that UVA was built on his cornfield. Charges had been made also about the Native American tribes encountered by the Lewis and Clark expedition across the country. You'll remember Jefferson sent them across the country exploring the land acquired by the Louisiana Purchase. And once again, the facts are that Jefferson seemed extraordinarily solicitous in dealing with these native tribes, although the same was not so much true of later administrations. So in conclusion, it seems quite clear that the woke left has gained control at Montpelier, Monticello, UVA, and other historical sites, and are using their position for destructive political purposes. And in this case, not surprisingly, none of the 3 charges against Thomas Jefferson by the woke left have any real substance to them and seem to be just a kind of political name calling, but to just summarize the three charges. The three charges against Jefferson were slavery, selling hemmings, and Native Americans, and none of the three really have any substance to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. We're going to go on now to our third presenter, Jim Bowden. Jim is a longtime activist and writer. And Bob, if you could turn your camera off and mute yourself. Jim co-founded the Virginia First Foundation. He earned graduate degrees at Harvard University and Columbia University. He taught at William and Mary. His article on the 1619 Project is on my American Renaissance Network website, amrennet.us. And he's going to be talking about how the 1619 Project is lousy propaganda. Take it away, Jim.
Chris asked me to write up a piece on the 1619 Project, and the first draft of it that I wrote, I basically talked about it was culture Marxism and how woke it was. And then Chris, doing his best Sergeant Friday impression, for those who are old enough to remember that, said, "No, Jim, the facts, just the facts." So here we are. This is the 1619 Project presents itself as history, but it's not. It's journalism. It was a series of essays that was published in the New York Times. It was published, it was supported by the Pulitzer Center and put together in 2019. And they also a number of podcast series, and they're put together to spread it, to proselytize it. So it's 10 essays, a photo essay, and a collection of poems and fiction. And that's the list of the essays. If you just look at the titles of the essays, that gives you a flavor for where we're going. And I'm not going to read all these slides to you. I'm going to whip through them, and I'll be done in 10 minutes here. It tells you where they're coming from just by looking at the titles of the essays. Okay. All right. First problem is, as I said, it's not history, it's journalism. And worse, this is the most important thing, it gets the facts wrong. Now, the facts obviously are fundamental to history. The really bad part is that it's marketed, and I mean marketed, to schools as history, when it's really, really lousy propaganda. I don't have the list of the historians here, but eminent liberal, not conservative, historians stake their reputations on criticizing what they produced. So we're going to get into some of the meat potatoes of what they assert. One digression. They do have facts included in the 1619 Project, but they cherry pick their facts and then they put them together in a narrative that tells the story that they want to tell. I've seen I've seen social scientists, economists and social scientists, historians, and engineers who have PhDs in the same field scream at each other, argue politely, and also seen them scream at each other over disputes they have within their field. But those arguments that they had, so there is room for legitimate discourse. There's room for legitimate arguments. I mean, there's some people who dispute the reasons for the recent unpleasantness in 1861, 1865, otherwise known as the War of Northern Aggression. But the people who were at the 1619 went beyond the pale. And the facts that they cherry picked, they got some of the facts wrong. So not only is their narrative screwed up, but the very basis for their narrative is screwed up. So we'll rock and roll through these slides here. They argue that the war or revolution was based on preserving slavery. And there's absolutely no historical record of anyone saying it anywhere. It asserts that Lincoln was a racial colonizer because at one time he did say the slaves should be freed and sent back to Africa. He later changed his mind. He spoke differently as time went on. He claims that capitalism and economic growth driven by slavery. Again, y'all can read that. You go to the next slide. it talks about slavery being essential to capitalism, when in fact it was ancillary. It was a it was part of capitalism, always part of our economy, but our economy, there's a labor shortage in the United States, or in the English-speaking peoples in the English-speaking peoples who are now the United States of America. There was a labor shortage from 1607 till 1932. And the 1932 was the first time, or 1930 rather, excuse me, 1930 was the first time there was more labor than there were jobs. First time in our history. Slavery filled that niche, but not completely. There's always still a labor shortage, and it doesn't account for all the incredible growth. If you read the monetary history, Milton Friedman's Monetary History of the U.S., the answer is it's not slavery that makes capitalism work. It's capital. It's capital. Our economy is based on capital. So it mischaracterizes things. It talks about slavery as it was in the antebellum period, right, a couple of decades before the War of Northern Aggression, and it doesn't account for the really complex slavery that existed in different parts of the country, including all the colonies, including New England, much earlier than that. So again, it really reaches for things to say that the recent vote on the light rail project in Atlanta, some of the counties that are out there, cities that have seceded from Atlanta, don't want to have light rail, and they're saying it was an exercise in racial prejudice. Then again, it's a simple dichotomy of white versus black, simple binary choices of the permanent class of victims. What I like to refer to as the Hollywood hierarchy of evil. There's also a highly, in terms of who's the worst evil character, and then who's next worst, second worst. You also have a corresponding Hollywood hierarchy of victims and the permanent victimhood that's established. It ignores racial conflicts that are not unique to the United States, and it doesn't, as I said, the many causes of secession. It's just a set of essays. It shouldn't pretend to be a history book. And that's it for my slides. So my final thought is this: it's being used by school boards. You can ask your schools about it, and I recommend you look at the Getting Transparency. A year ago, I worked on and submitted to the History and Social Studies SOLs, and the SOLs were keen to point out we had a food fight over it at the end of 22 on it, or 23 on it, and the SOLs are one thing, but the teachers' guides will not be put into public, and that's where we really need to look. That's where you need to look at what's being taught in the schools, and key again, go to the school boards, find out what's being taught, and make sure that 1619 is not being taught.
Thank you very much. We're going to go on now to our final presenter, Jeff Wallace. He's a member of Potomac Tea Party's executive committee, and he also sits on the board of my nonprofit. We give away grants to the best grassroots fighters we can find across the country. It's called the Liberty Sentinels Fund. Jeff wrote an article on Norman Rockwell that is on our Potomac Tea Party website, and he's going to talk to us about Norman Rockwell now. Go ahead, Jeff.
All right. So where this originated, if you noticed at the end of Claudia's presentation, when she ran out of time, she was looking at some of the funding for some of these people who've been funding a lot of these radical agendas. And the first item up there was the Mellon Foundation. So I went to monitor them a bit. And one of the first things I found, is a little bit off topic here, but not unrelated. All right, great. So what I found was there was on their page, there was this, they did a reimagining of the four freedoms. Go to presenter mode. Okay. So came across this billboard that they had built. You don't have to strain to look at it. You're going to see a larger version in a minute. These are based on the four freedoms. You know, the freedom as shown here, freedom of speech, freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of worship. Back in my tour guide days, when I used to walk through the FDR Memorial, I'm no fan of FDR's economic policies. He turned our recession into a Great Depression, but that's a sidebar. But I like to talk about these, the famous paintings by Norman Rockwell. And for those, oops, there we go. And they're the four freedoms in all their glory. You know them, love the classics, part of American history. I'm not a big art person, but I've always been a big fan of Norman Rockwell. I love just just the way he tells his stories, like the detail, like the people's facial expressions, little things on the side. You could just literally write a short story about any one of his pictures. And so as I was going through, I came across, when I went into that Mellon Foundation page, I found the larger versions of each, and let's go through them one by one, because they're updated for a more modern look, if that modern look is the demographics of a bad superhero show on the CW network. So first off, we get to freedom of speech, and we've got basically the white man has been replaced by Rosario Dawson, with her right hand resting on the shoulder of what appears to be her lesbian girlfriend. And in front of them, looking over, is a resident MS-13 member looking back at them. Again, you'll notice in this picture, noticeably absent, there isn't a single white man, because that is the demographic that absolutely is not entitled to free speech, according to the radical left. Moving right along. Whoops. Well, it's called to leave the meeting. Don't want to do that. There we go. Now we get to freedom from fear. I think this was the least offensive out of all of them, aside from the obvious race swapping of your white family. Two noticeable changes. One, the kids are no longer sleeping in the same bed, as was far more common back then, and not that evil prosperity that capitalism bought. There's the headline of the newspaper the dad's holding. The original mentions some bombings, while this one only mentions sanctions against some country. Again, also a tribute to the decades of the more peaceful world the U.S. has led since World War II. And of course, in keeping with modern times, the redheaded kids are now black. And as one of the people on this call noted, if you look at the posture, the way the dad is, it looks more like a mom who's just coming over for visitation. The dad's keeping an eye on her in front of his kids. All right, onward. Freedom of worship. Now we notice we've got all the major religions represented here, of course, except for any kind of Christian religion. And, if you look up in the upper right corner, that somewhat androgynous person is no doubt praying to the BLM sign on their front lawn. Not much more to say about this, so onward. Freedom from want. Notice how the Thanksgiving, this is the worst, the one that I find absolutely the most offensive. Yes, you have your sufficiently diverse crowd, and I don't know, maybe it's just me, or just like they were all kind of badly and lazily photoshopped in. I don't know, that's just me. Notice what's conspicuously absent. Yes, there are no older family members. This is not like some traditional family dinner. Grandma and grandpa have been replaced. Instead of showing the extended family gathering at the table, we have what looks like some cheesy Friendsgiving. My guess is it's probably a collection of a bunch of leftists who have been uninvited from their annoying preachiness at Thanksgiving table. None of their families wanted them, so they just got together where they could preach at it. The one thing I will say in their credit, at least they're actually serving an actual turkey and not a massive tofu log, and it does appear that the head of the table is a married couple. So I'll give them credit for that. So that's the four freedoms, but one last one for you in the dishonorable mention department. A while back, I went to Mad Magazine's website as a Gen Xer. That was a major part of my childhood. And I came across this bit of effluent. Yeah, this came around the summer of St. George Floyd. Of course, they had to destroy a classic picture. And, as Ivan Drago's manager would once say, to paraphrase him, what they touch, they destroy.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Quite interesting. I had no idea that was going on until you brought it to our attention. I'm going to put the last question to all the panelists. It comes from Gary Meredith in the chat. Notice how we Americans are always on defense. Why don't we demand of our domestic enemies to produce the greatest example of a better nation? They can't answer. Why not demand they shut up? Bob, you get the last word.
Okay, yes. Well, I think China and some of these other nations like Russia, I think they would say they are the better nation and they do have the better system. The problem that I have is that our politicians don't have the guts or the what to carry the principles of our nation forward. And that is, it seems to me that Trump so far is the only politician I can see who seems to have the courage and the fortitude to do that.
Thank you, Bob, for your comments. I became aware of a term, oikophobia, in the last year. It means where the elites hate a country. So we have American elites hating America now. It happened in the French Revolution. French elites hated France, and it happened before the Communist Revolution in China. The Chinese elites hated China. So we're not the first to experience it, but it's very destructive. You can help us by being our eyes and ears at these historic sites. Please let us know if you see a warped version of American history being presented when you visit these places, and send us articles you see on the subject. It's mail@potomacteaparty.com. And I'll close on a note of hope. Public pressure does work. It caused the National Archives to reverse its position and take the trigger warnings off the Constitution, the Declaration, and the Bill of Rights. And it also worked within the last month, where it caused the Biden administration to reverse course on attempting to take down the statue of William Penn in Pennsylvania. So we got to make a lot of noise, and we can prevail on these questions. And with that, we'll close.